We're at 103. Who are we missing?
I think the only is Mary.
Mayor? So we'll get started because I think we're going to have a fairly short amount of time before the others join us with the Adequacy group, and we start in with Michael and John's presentation. So we'll call meeting of the Commission's Fiscal Policy Work Group. It's June 1st, 2020 at 1 o'clock, and thanks everybody for joining us as we enter the month of June. Let's see, a little bit of housekeeping on this meeting. People may have noticed in the calendar now, we're allowing attendees to join, or enabling attendees to join and watch these meetings live now as well. And so, sort of, baby steps as we can do more with this platform and do it on a safe basis. So so just for I think most people have heard it before, but certainly for the new people who are attending, although it doesn't affect it won't affect the attendees, but these meetings are recorded, and the recordings are available, will be available following the meeting on the CARC website. And we try to encourage people not to put stuff in chat just because it doesn't have the type of accessibility or access transparency that the video and audio have. So if you want to say something like, I'm jumping off the meeting now or something like that, that's fine. But sort of, please don't go too much further than that. And I think there is also a Q&A feature on here. We're not going to be doing Q&A on here. Hopefully sometime in the near future we're going to be resuming public comment, which we may do through that feature. We'll be looking into that a little bit more. So anyway, Jordan, how are we doing on tech?
It looks like all good. Haven't noted any access issues. Yeah, so I think
okay. Okay, fantastic. Before we begin, it's obviously we're going through a really troubling time with a lot of really difficult events even in the last week, but not just the last week, and of course this is on top of the pandemic world that we're living in right now too. But last night as peaceful demonstrations turned a lot more violent. While I hadn't planned on Sunday evening watching the news all night, it was hard for me to turn away from what was going on in Boston. And it's a city where I went to college and familiar with and have lots of friends down there. And my son and daughter were living down there, and in a very sort of shallow sense, I guess, my first thoughts as I saw things starting to be lit on fire was, boy, I'm glad my kids don't are out of Boston now, and they are out of Boston, and at least for the time being. And I just want to say this because I think these are thoughts that I'm when I sort of process what's going on, I recognize that it's a lot more significant problem than just my kids being down there. And I think when you take a look at the problem or problems that we're trying to address in public education and equitable access, and even when we talk about school financing or school funding in New Hampshire, we've many times run into the prevailing, everybody's looking out for my kids, and it's something that Mel's talked about a lot. And that was sort of my initial reaction, saying things last night. So in the context of what we're doing, it makes me feel that what we're doing is even more important, because I think it is directed to helping reduce the disparities, providing better improving equitable access to education, helping to mitigate the lack of opportunity that certain groups, certain people have in our society, that people have in our society. And but also I think it also sort of shows how easy it is to for people to look at refer to my kids as opposed to our kids, and that's going to be a very much a challenge for for this committee's work and this commission's work. So anyway, it's last week and right now, obviously, I think really difficult times. I'm not sure it's over anytime soon, and it's going to require a lot of work, but it's also something that is systemic in our culture. And anyway, I just wanted to share some thoughts, but I'd like to open the floor to others on the work group who may also want to share some thoughts or how they're feeling going through this. So. Somebody pick it up. Rick, you're muted.
I should be unmuted now.
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
I'll just tag in with a few words here. I think it's our responsibility, from a fiscal responsibility here, I think, because that's what we're all about on this committee, to try to find those causations that are causing these challenges to equitable and education, and those disparities which we know that exist between school districts. I'm wanting to know if it's due to poor management, supervision. Is it due to lack of funding these individual needs, maybe ELL, special education? Our communities in this part of the world, up in northern New Hampshire, have a pretty similar makeup with clientele from east to west, north to south. So I'm not going to equate what we have going on here to what's going on in Boston, as you referenced, Dave, or to LA or Chicago or Minneapolis. I think our disparities here are because I truly believe that, even though I know there are some cultural biases and there's some discrimination, I don't think it's a huge thing in the North Country. I think it's one of which the disparity is more economic driven. And somehow that's what we as a group have to respond to. How are we going to provide weighted support to these communities that need that assistance to provide more of an equal education?
Thanks, Rick, for sharing that. Yeah, my point was really that there exists in New Hampshire disparities, and that's something that we're addressing, or will be addressing.
Yeah, and I'll follow up to that, Dave. Yes, and as I said this morning when we were on the engagement sub work, I lived in a community where I was a minority in terms of my culture, my skin color. When I lived in Alaska, we lived in a Yupik and Yupiat community, and my younger daughter grew up learning how to speak Yupiat. And that was her foreign language when she went off to college and became a speech pathologist. We were always treated equally, without discrimination, and very much accepted. When I look at the little valley I'm living in up here, all the generations preceding, most of the people here in this town go back 8 generations or so. And we're a very closed society. And I don't know if we always recognize or understand some of those real disparities and inequities and hardships encountered in Boston, in our real urban areas. And it could be Manchester as well, but I don't live down that way. I don't see that.
Dave, if I could pick up on I want to add some facts about New Hampshire. We're completing the Civic Health Index right now for New Hampshire. We'll hope to publish it later this summer, but let me just pull a couple of things off that Civic Health Index about race and how race matters in New Hampshire. So for example, we look at the average income, income of African Americans in New Hampshire versus whites. It's about 40%, African Americans in New Hampshire earn about 40% less than our white population. And that's one of the biggest income gaps in the country. So, and we can, the same kind of proportion, it shows up, for example, right now in who's getting infected with COVID-19. So African Americans are infected at a rate about 4 times their proportion in the population. Hispanics and Latinos are infected at a rate about twice their level in the New Hampshire population. African Americans hold a bachelor's degree, about 15% fewer hold a bachelor's degree. And in terms of our makeup, I think there's been this long-standing incorrect narrative that New Hampshire is a white state. Of course, that was never true. These days, about 30% of all the kids under 18, young people under 18 in Manchester and Nashua are young people of color. So as the commission grapples with questions of economic disparity, wealth disparities, these other racial disparities and ethnic disparities do make a difference, as we know, over the lifetime. And I'm hoping, I'm optimistic that as we address the funding disparities around public education in the state, that'll have an effect on the broader social disparities that we're not trying to resolve, but the way we fund our public schools will be one step towards creating a more equitable and more inclusive state. So that's just, there's been a tendency, I think, for us in New Hampshire to say, these are issues that other states, other urban centers, other populations have to deal with. But in fact, that's just not true and is increasingly less so. I'll stop there.
No, thanks for providing that.
I think a challenge in our charge is the leading with adequacy, and I think we're going to keep stumbling across what equity means, because as I read the background, and I was really mindful of something Jesse said the other day, that our focus is adequacy. And as he said, you can't, of course, equity goes along with adequacy, but equity isn't leading our charge here, and that's going to be a challenge for us because I think we're all conscious of the inequities, but it's a different concept than adequacy. And I think that that's going to be something we really wrestle with as we look at funding sources. I mean, it's all very complicated as I go back through the history, the paper that Jason said before this meeting, adequacy rather than equity is kind of the through line. And how that interacts with equity, I think only is only going to come to the fore in a way that is resolvable from an output perspective. But I think it's something we need to worry about.
So Chris, I thank you for trying to keep us between the guardrails here. So that made me look back at the original legislation that created the commission. And so let me just read from the first item on the commission's charge: to review the funding formula and make recommendations to ensure a uniform and equitable design for financing the cost of an adequate education. So the legislature introduced this concept of equitable design. We don't know what that means, and we're trying to figure that out. But I think that's where the convergence of attention to adequacy and convergence to equity comes.
But when you look through this, the way equitability comes in when financing is discussed, typically in the history here, not when inputs or outputs are discussed. And that I think is something
yes, and then
we need to wrestle with.
The third charge then is to identify trends and disparities across the state in student performance. So there is, and then the next charge refers to the need to provide an opportunity for an adequate education. So we're trying to figure out the opportunity, disparity, equity language that's in this charge to us. We don't want to go beyond that. We can't go beyond that. But
well, we may want to fashion though a statement or a value or whatever, because I just think it's very muddy. And you can think of disparities from an accountability perspective rather than an opportunity perspective. So I think there may be, I mean, if we have the value of equitable opportunity, we may need to come forward more clearly with that as we go into these discussions.
I think it's really, it's a very complex issue as we're just discussing. But I can recall when we had the task force back 2 years ago in 2018, and we were looking at the achievement scores throughout this state. And when we looked at equalized valuation per pupil, those communities which had an equalized valuation per pupil of $660,000 or less, 85% of those communities had their kids scoring in the lowest 2 quartiles on achievement. So we know that there's a direct relationship between how we fund these schools and support those schools through fiscal management of our dollars, that has a relationship to achievement. So and when I look at these communities, most of them are small rural communities that don't have a lake and don't have the tourism, and they're alone, they're isolated. And I would venture to say the makeup of the population in terms of cultural background are very, very different than Salem or Bedford or Manchester or Concord. They are probably more white than they have, than the other larger ones I just spoke of. So I think all these things impact. Yes, I'm not negating that, but I think it's primarily poverty that's driving the ship here.
So Rick and Chris, thanks for that. What I took from Chris's remarks I think I think the commission is working up to a point where we're really going to put some definition behind the problem. But I think it's in the definition, and it's in what are the principles that we want to embrace on this. And Rick, you're sort of jumping a little bit into the solution space there, which is fun to do, and we're going to get there too. But we're still in the problem space right now, and I think I think it's very timely, given this how this conversation has gone, about what we're going to be talking about for the next 35 minutes or so, and leading up to the 2 o'clock presentation from John and from Michael, because I think what we learned from the court decisions, I think, is going to help us put some definition around the terms that you were talking about and that Chris was talking about, and how it all fits in with the charge, with the elements from our statutory charge, because at the end of the day, it's really what we're going to put out are some recommendations. Well, we're going to put out a lot, identification of the definition of the problem, potential solutions, how we worked on one, and then policy recommendations. And the report that we create, I think needs to be useful to different constituencies, whether that's the governor's office, the Senate, and the House policy writers. So anyway, Mary, do you want to share any thoughts on what, Manchester's come up a couple of times in the discussion here, so.
Well, Manchester has a wide range of problems, and equity is a major problem in our city. And I think we saw actually a pretty peaceful demonstration here in Manchester. There were a couple of arrests, but those were kind of outliers but people are working hard. We have Manchester Proud that's done a lot of work. And actually, Liz Canada has been working with a group of folks, and Manchester Proud actually has another equity that's spun off that really looks at equity in the city of Manchester and really how to engage and make sure that those opportunities are there for everybody. So there's a lot of things going on, but we have a long, long, long way to go. And when you look at the assessment scores from Manchester over the last 25 years, they have been, and when you disaggregate the scores are they pretty much shout out what's happening. So a worthy conversation and an important one.
Thanks, Mary. John Beardmore, what's going on in Hopkinton?
I don't know, you tell me, Dave. I thought you run this town.
Yeah, right. So we had a school budget fail on Saturday. It was our I think the 7th question on the school budget. And of course, at a regular school district or school district meeting where you're all in the high school gym together, you get to your final result no matter how long it takes, and when you're doing everything sort of not in real time but in this distanced way, it's trying to fit a live school district meeting into a vote at the polls type of process is a very tough fit. But I think it's I think it's something that John, you and I and Mel and others have seen coming for a long time, which is if you can't pay your property taxes, how can you support a school budget? And yeah, John, go ahead.
Oh, it's an interesting turn of events in Hopkinton. I've been listening to the conversation. I think I generally agree with all your comments, Dave. I think, as I watch these protests, I think about education a lot, and I think it's the key to prosperity. And I think if we had to look across a common theme in the cities that are burning right now, I'd say educational and economic disparity is the common theme underneath the racial divisions. And I don't think we're immune from it in New Hampshire at all. And I think it's going to be a bigger issue going forward as the state becomes less white. But I think, to your point, Dave, we've got an interesting case study in Hopkinton, which is viewed as a fairly affluent town, although I think probably viewed to be more affluent than it really is. But definitely a town that prioritizes education and enjoys a great reputation for its schools, deservedly so. I live in Hopkinton really only because of the schools. We moved here for that reason 10 to 15 years ago. But I can't say that I'm surprised that the town has now twice voted down a proposed operating budget. And I think people are worried about the future. I think our current political leadership made a few missteps. I think this airplane could have been guided to a better landing path before the first meeting, but that's a little editorializing maybe. But I also think it's an interesting case study in the way we vote on budgets, education and otherwise in small towns. I used to be very sentimental about town meetings, and I have zero sentimentality for town meetings anymore. I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts, not unlike Hopkinton, where my grandparents were, legends in town meeting lore for driving issues home. And I think town meeting is an awful way to vote, but I also think SB2 is an awful way to vote. So maybe in another commission, we can think of a new way to vote for town budgets and school district budgets.
We had an interesting conversation this morning with the engagement community, and David Ryan was very articulate around what they're trying to do in Exeter regarding issues of race, issues of equity, and frankly the importance of public education as kind of the common ground for students to learn how to deal with diversity, both of color, of opinion, etc. And so I think what we're doing here is most important because we recognize that there is an inequity as it relates to how kids are receiving education, whether they be in Berlin in comparison to that of Bedford, for example. On a personal note, as I've watched what's been going on across the country, I just would fear, if I was a person of color, I would fear going out. And as a parent, I would be very fearful if my children were of color, and what my message would be to them as it relates to dealing with a society that clearly has a racial bias. And my biggest concern, and David and I talked about this earlier this morning, is where's the resolve here? How do you bring people together, some of which would just as soon have a white society and not a diverse society? And where's that conflict going to ultimately end up? I'm very fearful for the lack of leadership in trying to bring about some sense of calm around that. It does no good to have our national leader begin to criticize, in my opinion, and throw darts at governors who are trying to deal with this the best way they can. So I think we are in absolutely a chaotic period right now, dealing with this plus the pandemic that's there. We're very in unsettling times right now.
Right. Thanks, Mel. Jordan, I know Jay looks like he stepped away. Jordan or Jay, please feel free to add anything you'd like.
Yeah, I'll just say, as someone who's newer to this public process, I think a lot of the anger and despair, certainly from people of color and younger folks, is seeing system failure repeatedly over our lifetimes. I was 11 when September 11th happened, and the war on terror and various administrations and police brutality continuing. And I'll just say that working with this commission has been very heartening, in the sense that I think there's a right way to be transparent and to express the values that you have and to try to govern in that way. And I think that's what a lot of these efforts are driving us at. And to the extent that we can be part of that process, I feel heartened by that. And, in the minor role that we have to play in the whole big picture of all of this.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks. So if people ready to sort of shift into our prep plan for the 2 o'clock meeting, I was just going to sort of turn it over to Jordan. He uncovered, I don't know if it got emailed around to everybody, the Fed report.
Yeah, I included that in a link.
Okay.
Sorry, but before Jordan jumps in, I'll note that Drew Atchison from AIR has joined us, and that'll be the practice with all of our work groups and full commission meetings, that AIR will be present. We don't expect Drew to be, if we have a question for him, but he'll be attending to what's going on in our work group, so AIR can provide us good resources. I just wanted to make sure if anybody had any questions about who this new face in the plaid shirt is, that's Drew.
Great. Thanks for introducing Drew. Drew, anytime you want to jump in, or if you have a question or something like that, please raise your hand or do it electronically, or just jump in, because it's important that we make sure we get your questions answered as well, or if you got something to add, if we're fumbling around with something. Something I did fumble around with was I didn't do the roll call at the beginning of the meeting. So while I feel we have had some very substantive discussion on our country and about New Hampshire, before we jump into fiscal policy work group discussions, I'd just like to call the roll. So Dave Luno reporting from Hopkinton. Mel Myler.
Mel Myler reporting from Hopkinton.
John Beardmore. Oh, we got all the Hopkinton people.
John Beardmore, also from Hopkinton.
Mary Heath.
Mary Heath here in Manchester.
And Chris Dwyer.
Chris Dwyer in Portsmouth.
And Rick Ladd.
Rick Ladd and Haverhill.
Fantastic. And with us also are Bruce Mallory, Jordan Hensley, and Drew Atchison, and Senator Khan is with us from Keene. So great. With that, I'd like to sort of turn things over to Jordan to introduce this document, which is really sort of a review of education funding in New Hampshire. I think it had been referred to a couple of times in meetings.
Yeah. So this is a document we've had for a little while as a commission. It's up on the website on our resources page, has been as well. But I sent it around to commission folks. It's New Hampshire's quest for a constitutionally adequate education. It's a document put together by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and it's from 2006, so it's a little bit dated, but it gives a nice overview of course, the first couple of Claremont rulings, and then also sort of talks about some of the efforts that have been made since those rulings between then and 2006, which, for those of us that are a little more familiar with the 2008 to the present work, it's a nice background. And just thought that it'd be nice to review in the sense that getting us ready for the presentation upcoming by John Tobin and Michael Tierney, who I see are on our attendees right now. So if we have, if they're listening in, we may be able to bring them into the discussion. But they'll be giving a presentation, and we just kind of thought that it might make sense for us to think about, as a fiscal policy group, what are our constraints, what are our boundaries, what are the things we need to be thinking about as we're thinking about fiscal policy. The state of New Hampshire has, the Supreme Court has given some obligations that have to be adhered to. And so any plan that comes out of this work group and out of the full commission are gonna have to follow those guidelines. And so, the first big piece is state government being responsible for providing the constitutionally adequate education. So it's not up to each locality. And so that's why we're all here doing this state level work. And for our purposes, what that really means is, or the really important piece of that is talking about New Hampshire, the state, as the taxing district for an adequate education. And that leads into conversations about SWEPT and tax rates, and what does that mean to have the state as the taxing district, and what does that mean for what our eventual funding mechanisms look like? Because
so Jordan, one of the things that I'd like to do as we and we don't have a whole lot of time until 20 minutes or so.
Mm-hmm.
If we go through this, is try to pull out some things that might help us define terms. One of the things we struggled with a little bit this morning in the public engagement work group was, for example, and Rick and I think sort of, we're talking about this. What's the difference between the cost of adequacy and, quote, the cost of an opportunity for an adequate education? And I think the discussion from this morning, just to sort of just unpack it very quickly, was that these are two different things that have different price tags to them and contain different responsibilities. Is that sort of about right, Rick?
Yeah, I definitely think they're two separate things.
Right. And I think it's important that as we move forward, and as we move towards doing a report, that we're really rigorous when it comes to the terminology we use, and that we don't use cost of adequacy interchangeably with the cost of an opportunity for an adequate education. Unless that's wrong, unless maybe those two things are the same. But my understanding is that they're different. But I think we'll get to that maybe as we go through this Fed report and as we hear from John and Michael.
Yeah, to that point, and it was, I think it's on the second page of that report, when it says a constitutionally adequate education must expose students to social, economic, scientific, technological, political complexities of the world in which they live. It's hard for me to juxtapose that with an input-based approach to adequacy. And I think that's related to the point that you're just making. So if that's not quoted, but I assume it's from the decision where the Supreme Court talked about it must be constitutionally adequate. So it seems to me, if we're working with definitions around adequacy, that the term constitutionally adequate is an important topic to get in there. And that to me does suggest a methodology that you couldn't possibly think of an input base as exposing students to those complexities. You would only know that in an output fashion, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Chris. And it, also from that quote, I highlighted that on that very same thing on my copy of the report that I'm working with. That there's a dynamic element to that
Right.
as well, and you know, and well. So anyway, sorry about that, Jordan.
No, I think that's great, and I think that's really what's important and what we're going to need to grapple with here is these definitions, and both the definitions that we create for ourselves and the definitions that have been given to us in some ways. So yeah, I mean, I think thinking, yeah, constitutionally adequate education versus inadequate education versus the opportunity for an adequate education. And all of those things are sort of one piece of the system, and then another piece of the system then is how does that get funded in a way that is proportionate and reasonable, and that means equal in valuation and uniform in rate. And as we've talked about, equal in valuation and uniform in rate, does that apply to all properties? Are there different, you know, we're going to hear later about the ABC classes of property, how there might be a way to have different classes of property valued at different rates. And that's got to be part of the discussion that we have as well. And these are some of the questions I think that are coming up that will help us sort of shape the questions that we'll be asking and trying to get some clarity from John Tobin and Michael Tierney here. What might that look like? What do these systems want to be? I think these are things we're really going to need to grapple with.
And one thing that I have a really hard time understanding the logic for is a point that you mentioned about defining the state as the taxing district in the way that the court defined it. And I wonder if that has been taken up since then in other, you know, in other decisions. I mean, it seemed to, at least as explained in the paper, it's defining it by the function that the tax is used for, which makes absolutely no sense to me. And that seems to be a kind of a core building block here. So I wonder if anyone can shed any light on that. It's again, it's on the third page, and it says that the court determined that because of the way that the tax is being used, therefore the state is the taxing district. And that's the first time I had seen that so clearly, and it really threw me for a loop because it just doesn't make any sense. And I'm wondering if somebody can explain better to me how a court could actually determine that.
No, Chris, in looking at the report and going to page 5, and where you have been talking about, it says the appropriate treatment of towns with excess property tax revenue would remain a major consideration of each subsequent education financing plan. We've gone from A to Z on that, and we don't seem to be able to get it resolved. I'm talking in terms of statewide education property tax. Is it there to support an equal education throughout our state for all students, or is it for a local revenue gainer for the town? And we don't seem to want to resolve, and we don't seem to want to deal with it anymore because you get in this donor versus non-donor town conversation.
Right.
Right, but I'm trying to I'm trying to, get, as we get to, we're here with Chris's question right now that the taxing district has more to do with, what did you say, Chris? Has more to do with how the revenues are used as opposed
Yes.
to the responsibility of the district.
It says because it was used to fund what the court determined was an obligation to provide education. So that it determined it was a taxing district because the use of the funds was to provide education. And that seems like such a circular, it doesn't seem worthy of the Supreme Court, frankly. And so I wonder what else is needed to understand that, or if that's been taken up in other rulings.
So as opposed to, let's say, Chris, that it's a state taxing district, or the taxing district is the state because the funding responsibility is the state. Is that a different?
Well, but it's just hard for me to think of, having lived in New Hampshire all my adult life as a taxpayer, thinking that the taxing entity for property taxes is the state. That just, I can't quite make those two things come together, because it's really saying here that the property tax is a state tax. And that's the part that the court declared the property tax a state tax.
I think I think that's different than the local property tax. I think that there's a state education property tax, which is a state tax, and there's local property tax, which is not a state tax.
But determining it to be the state tax because you have the obligation, as opposed to who has the obligation to raise that revenue, which is local. That it just seems like a fundamental confusion compared to how we otherwise think about taxing in our state.
Well, I mean, we raise money for counties from property taxes too.
Yes, but I don't consider, we don't call that a statewide tax. That is the county tax, and we pay it locally. I think of that as we're paying for services, we're paying for a share of our support, but we don't declare the property tax to be a county tax then.
No, it is a county tax. It's actually, the rate is set at the county level.
Right, and we pay it locally.
Collected locally.
Collect it locally.
And then remitted to the county, because the tax collection is being done locally. But we also collect motor vehicle registration, state motor vehicle fees, which is a tax. We collect that locally and send it to the state. Rooms and meals taxes are collected by restaurants and hotels and sent to the state. John,
What's that, Dave?
No, just in terms of the difference between a state tax and a local tax. Does it have to do where it's collected?
No, I don't think so. I think it has to do with the way it's raised and appropriated. The statewide property tax is raised on a statewide warrant. The Commissioner of Revenue sets the warrant for the statewide education property tax, and it's raised equally on every taxable parcel, whether you're in Hopkinton or whether you're in Portsmouth. You're going to see a different rate on your property tax bill because your properties are assessed differently by local assessors at a different point in time. So the State Department of Revenue equalizes those assessments, apportions the responsibility to raise each share of tax equally, of the total tax equally among the towns, and then the towns raise that amount on their local assessed value, which results in a different rate town to town, but there's an equalized state rate. So I would say the statewide property tax is a state tax, the county property tax is a county tax, and the local school and the local education, local town and the local village district are local taxes. You just see all three on the same bill.
Yeah, could I jump in, Dave?
Please, Jim.
My reading this weekend has been over the court cases. So I'm sorry, Jordan, that I missed your article, which I'm now searching back through hundreds of emails to try to find. But there's an easier way, I know.
Jordan, you could just send it to him.
No,
Yeah,
I can look up Jordan. I do it all the time. But what the state doesn't raise does fall to the towns. That's in the court rulings. And so what John has described as a process by which it goes is exactly what the courts have interpreted as the constitutional descending responsibility. It's the cascading responsibility. What isn't raised by the state to support what the state says constitutionally must be supported does cascade down to local levels. And so I think it'd be interesting, to hear what our folks in the next hour say, but I think that's true. The other thing that it says is enhance the opportunity. Sorry, I'm jumping. That was a thought from the last conversation. What is the wording in the Constitution that grounds us to adequacy? Well, not there. Adequacy is not there. They didn't use the word. They used the word enhance. Embrace opportunity. Embrace being a higher level choice of word as opposed to encourage. And
are you talking about the use of the word cherish?
Cherish, yes, cherish.
Yeah.
Cherish the opportunity being a
So they actually refer to it on page 2 of the report. The ruling was based on the encouragement of literature clause in the New Hampshire Constitution, which states, quote, "It shall be the duty of the legislature and magistrate to cherish public schools."
Yeah. Well, that's not exactly cherish public and private institutions, I believe. Anyway.
Well, this is in quotes from the report, so. It's not in quotes from the
I'll
Constitution.
show you a page, anyway. We all have pages. Yeah. I'm just trying to link back to, I think there's some good conversation to be had around the constitutional interpretations.
Mm-hmm. So,
I agree.
All right, Bill, how are you doing?
Thank you, Barrister.
So we've got 4 minutes before we transition to over to the adequacy work group. I see a couple of questions that are sort of have been put on the table, and hopefully John and Michael will be able to talk about them either during their presentation or after in Q&A. One of them sort of surrounds the definition of the term constitutionally adequate, and then maybe some additional conversation as to the state as a taxing district and what the responsibilities are that the state have for raising funds within a state taxing district in a proportional and reasonable way, and then I think also our questions with respect to definitions of cost of adequacy versus cost of an opportunity for an adequate education, and also how Chris talked about outcomes versus inputs. So how do those things relate to cost of inadequate education or cost of adequacy, because I think outcomes would seem to embrace a lot of different things than necessarily inputs would embrace. And then, you know, as we move forward, really maybe putting together some sort of, I don't know, Bruce, does this make sense? Some sort of lexicon of consistent use of terms?
It makes sense. It may be the highest order request you've made of us so far.
So, I don't know, but
yeah, that's our work, isn't it? Yeah, that's part of our design thinking process. Let's
Yeah.
define the terms. And this is really healthy way of grappling with this at this stage in our process. And John and Michael have joined us.
great.
Probably listening to that past conversation, they're thinking that they'd like to change the slide so they can just address those direct questions that we just had. But this will be very informative to us.
Yeah,
Dave, you can wrap up, you know, whenever.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. What I'd like to well, obviously the fiscal policy group are hanging with us because this is where fiscal policy and adequacy are overlapping today. And if you can continue to hang on, I know that I think John said he's going to have to drop off for a business meeting in about a half hour, but if you can either come back later or you can hang on for a third hour, I know it's asking a lot, but I think that's going to be an opportunity for some Q&A with John and Michael, who we appreciate very much taking the time to meet with us this afternoon. And so please don't anybody feel that they have to jump off just because we're transitioning, you know, to the adequacy group. I think this is going to be a really great conversation, a great presentation. And Jay, I will turn it. We've already opened our meeting and roll called our folks, so I'm going to just hand it over to you.
Precisely. And Bruce, you want to? I mean, I can see some of the faces here, and I know who we're going to call. So I can do it. Bill Ardinger.
Yes, thank you all. Good to see you all. I hope all you're doing well. This is Bill Ardinger. I'm in Concord and no one is with me.
Thank you, Bill. Iris, good morning.
Hi.
Good afternoon.
Hi, at home in Barrington. My daughter and my husband are somewhere around, but not in the room.
Thank you. Yeah. Barbara.
Hi, I'm in Keene and my husband is in the other room. Thank you.
Thank you. Jane.
Hi, Jane Bergeron here in Litchfield, home alone.
Chris.
Chris Dwyer in Portsmouth.
And Jay Kahn in Keene, by myself in Keene. All right.
And Jay,
Good.
it looks like Val is not with us.
Oh, Val, thank you.
Just want to note that. I don't know if he's planning on joining.
I think I received a note from him that he is not available today.
Okay. And we can also note on the call for those folks that are listening that Jordan Hensley of Carsey is present. Bruce Mallory is on the call, present from Kittery Point, Maine. Nobody else in the room with me. Drew Atchison from AIR has joined us. Bruce Baker, I see, has joined us as well, and Jesse Levin, all from AIR. So I think that identifies all the folks on this call.
So I see two guests on our screen, and I want to thank John Tobin and Michael Tierney for volunteering to be with us today. I guess we'll hear, hopefully you're going to ground us more, not so much in the Conval lawsuit, but more in our task of trying to define adequacy. And I think you've heard some of the questions about trying to be a little bit more outcome-based than input, and you probably have wrestled with the same issue. welcome to the group. And John, you've been watching us for a while. Have you guys worked out who's doing which presentation first? And Bruce, did you have a comment?
Yeah, Jay, before we quite get to Michael and John in that order, just a couple of comments that we typically try to make at the beginning of our work group meetings, recognizing that we've just started a new work group from the previous one. And that is to welcome also the folks that are listening in as attendees today, and inviting attendees can use the question and answer, the Q&A function that's on the screen in the lower bar on your screen to make comments. This is one way we're trying to increase public accessibility and public input in our commission meetings. So even though that function is called Q&A, it's not really a place that you can ask questions that we'll respond to, but it is a place to enter written comments if you like. We'll be preserving those comments for the record of these meetings as well. We may at some point move to a time when we can actually take public comments online. We're hoping to do that. But in the meantime, please use the Q&A function for any comments you'd like to make based on what you've heard. And of course, as a reminder, you can make comments on the commission website at www.carc.unh/school-funding, or directly into our email, schoolfunding.commission@unh.edu. And so I just wanted to, and then if there are any technological issues or challenges, please notify either Jordan or me. Jordan, anybody calling in with tech or access challenges?
Nope, I think we are all good.
Okay, good. And just again, keeping our group agreements in mind to listen first. As we go into the conversation, focus on ideas, not people. Take risks and be raggedy, and ask good questions. Use the mute function on your screen in between comments, if you would please, to minimize feedback and background noise. And otherwise, you can chat to me or Jordan if you have a technical question or topic. All right, good. Thanks, Jay. I just want to get some housekeeping done. We've teed this up. I've worked with Michael and John. We think that the slide share and PowerPoint functions are going to work. And we'll start with Michael and then go to John after that.
And move to John. How much time are we going to need in the presentations, do you suppose?
I've asked each of them to give us about 20 minutes. And then, Jay, you can decide if you want to do Q&A after each presentation or wait until both presentations and then have a...
Yeah. And Michael, as you lead in here, maybe just so that we're all on the same page relative to where we are with this case, in the transition from the Superior Court to an appeal on that.
Absolutely. For those who don't know me, my name is Michael Tierney. I represent the Conval School District as well as Monadnock, Messinic, and the Winchester School Districts. We're right now in the case where a year ago, the Superior Court granted summary judgment in our favor, and we have an appeal. It's been filed by the state, which is pending. We've had the state's brief as well as our own brief filed with the Supreme Court, and the state has until June 26th to file their reply brief. So we're looking at likely oral argument later on this year, a decision possible by the end of the year or early in 2021. There's really two issues in the Conval case. The first is that base adequacy funding is inadequate in violation of Article 83 of the New Hampshire Constitution. And the second is that requiring disproportionate local property taxes to fund the state's obligation violates Part 2, Article 5 of the New Hampshire Constitution. So I'd like to just address three things that I think will be helpful to the commission. One is why the Conval case was brought in March 2019. Two, what happened at the Superior Court. And three, what is being argued at the Supreme Court later this year. So I think you all probably have had some experience with the roughly dozen cases dealing with education funding for the past 20 some odd years. I'm not going to talk about all of them in excruciating detail, but I think having a list of them reminds us that it's actually been some time since the last case, the 2008 Londonderry case, and even longer since the 2006 Londonderry case. But there are three snippets that I think are very important for the Conval case and are likely very important to the commission as well. First, from Claremont 2, in this state, a constitutionally adequate public education is a fundamental right, and the fundamental right at issue is the right to a state-funded, constitutionally adequate public education. That is exactly what's at issue in the Conval case, is the right to a state-funded, constitutionally adequate public education. In 2000, an opinion of justices, the court made clear that the state has the exclusive obligation and that the state may not shift any of the constitutional responsibility to the local communities. A few years later, in Londonderry School District v. State, the court reiterated that none of that financial obligation can be shifted to the school districts, regardless of the relative wealth or need. And so that's the constitutional background, the decisions of the court as Conval was looking at what was the present state of education funding in the state of New Hampshire at the time. The fact of the matter is that local taxpayers are funding the state's obligation. The state funding base is just 3,636 for the 2019 year and 3,708 for the 2020 and 2020 fiscal years. And no school district is able to educate a child at that level. It's many times that level are the actual needs of all of the school districts. And school districts may differ in their needs, but there's not a single school district that can do it under 12,000 per pupil. So in early 2019, there was HB 678 that proposed to increase the base adequacy to 9,929 exclusive of transportation. That House bill was, of course, not adopted, but that House bill served as the model for Conval's arguments to the Superior Court. On March 13th, they filed the case, making the arguments and requesting a preliminary injunction. A preliminary injunction is asking the court to make a preliminary and quick ruling, and to do so because if it doesn't do it by a certain date, the school districts would not be able to obtain the relief later on. Conval had argued that it was necessary to obtain the $9,929 per pupil by the April 1st final payment deadline, or else it would not be able to obtain it in the future, and that you can arrive at the $9,929 per pupil by just correcting the 5 most egregious errors in the state's existing 2008 costing framework. That 2008 costing framework is still in place today, and the 9,929 was not argued by anybody to be the absolute number. It was getting a whole lot closer to a cost of a constitutionally adequate education by correcting those 5 errors. The court, the Superior Court, did not grant the preliminary injunction. It did not say that it needed to do anything by April 1st. It specifically held that whatever the state was underfunding, Conval and the other districts could be achieved at a later date. So what really were the 5 errors in the 2008 costing formula? First, the student-teacher ratio. The costing formula said it was using the student-teacher ratio, but instead of using a student-teacher ratio, it was using maximum classroom size. And so if the state says you cannot have more than 30 students in a classroom, and you have a grade such as Winchester does of 32 eighth graders, you can't have a 30-to-1 ratio be the indication of the cost, because you need to have 2 teachers for those 32 students. And so it's really more like a 16-to-1 ratio. The other error was teacher benefits. In 2008, the teacher benefit costs were far lower than what they are in 2019 and 2020. Things such as the teacher retirement fund is statutorily required by the state. The cost of health insurance, all are several $1,000s more than what the 2008 costing formula was providing. Facilities costs. The 2008 costing formula had taken what was determined to be roughly $14,000 per pupil in facilities costs and decided that the state would provide 8% of the cost, not the 100% of the cost that the Supreme Court had held needs to be provided for providing an adequate education. The next category of error was completely leaving out any costing of the provision of a superintendent, the provision of a nurse, or the provision of food services, all of which the state has required either by statute or by regulation for the schools to provide. And if the state is requiring the school districts to provide these services, it is constitutionally required that the state provide the funding for those services. The fifth area is transportation. And transportation is a little bit different because while for all of the other areas, the state had in the 2008 costing formula averaged out and said that the averages could be used in having a base per pupil cost. Transportation is very different in large rural districts than it is in small compact districts. In the Conval School District, 3,000 miles are traveled by school buses on an average school day. And so that leads to transportation costs at many hundred times of what the state was providing in the 2008 costing formula. So if we look at the 2008 costing formula and make just a few changes, and the changes are highlighted here on the screen, you change the benefits from the roughly $11,000 to the $27,000. You go from a 1 to 25 and 1 to 30 student-teacher ratio to a 1 to 10 or 1 to 12.6 student-teacher ratio, which are the student-teacher ratios that
Michael, you're frozen a minute there, so you'll need to go back and repeat that. And if you can,
$5 for facilities.
Hey, Michael, you want to go back, just back up a little bit. You were frozen for a couple of minutes there.
Oh, I apologize.
If there's any way to expand the screen size too, that might help some of us.
Sorry.
You were on the 1 to 12 ratio when you froze.
Thank you. So the 1 to 12 is the state average, and so that's why Conval in the court case had argued that that would be an appropriate number to use. And that is all based on state Department of Education data. And down in the lower right-hand corner, you see the other changes that were made, putting in the facilities operations costs as well as the superintendent, nurse, and then the food services, which food services is something that all the school districts lose on a statewide average. I think it's over $60 million. I mean, statewide total, it's over $60 million a year. So it's a rather substantial expense that is required by the state. So what did the Superior Court rule? The Superior Court after hearing from the state and hearing from the school districts, held that the current scheme of funding education was unconstitutional as it pertains to the 4 petitioner school districts. And there are 3 reasons why the court held that it was unconstitutional. First, there was no rational basis for using maximum classroom sizes student-teacher ratios. Second, the facilities costing at only 8% of actual expenses is unconstitutionally arbitrary. And third, that there's no rational basis for excluding transportation aid for high school students. While some school districts have different transportation costs due to the size, the 2008 costing formula, which was still in place in 2019, made a determination that it would not provide any funding for high school students, and the court held that that was unconstitutional. The school districts had requested reconsideration of the Superior Court's order, and in particular, requested reconsideration of the transportation aid part of the order, because in addition to failing to provide funding for high school students, school districts wanted the court to rule on the fact that you can't have a statewide average number because it costs a lot more to transport students in the large rural districts than it does in small compact districts. And the Superior Court declined to do so, not because providing inadequate funding for transportation was permissible, but quite frankly, because even with varying transportation costs in different school districts, it is not beyond question that the legislature may fund transportation at a uniform per pupil rate that is so high that it would satisfy the transportation costs in a district, even with the most expensive transportation costs. Okay, so the costing formula was not unconstitutional because it said that it would provide the same amount of transportation aid to all of the school districts, because that one number for all of the school districts could be set at the Stewartson level and it would be permissible, although perhaps not wise. The Supreme Court appeal was filed by the state in September, and the state filed its brief on February 18th. It's important to realize that the state's brief is not alleging that it's fully funding inadequate education. The state never argued at the Superior Court that it was fully funding an education. Instead, the state's argument is that the court should not have considered the data that the State Department of Education publishes, as the state has not verified the accuracy of this data. So I think it's very important for this commission to understand that the state is not making the allegation that its base adequacy funding is actually adequate. The schools, for their part, filed a cross appeal, recognizing that the Superior Court was correct to hold the funding was constitutionally inadequate, but arguing that the Superior Court erred in not ordering a specific remedy. Most of the Superior Court's roughly 100-page order dealt with the Part 2, Article 83 violation, that the base adequacy at $3,700 per pupil is roughly a third of what it needs to be. But the second half of the case, the state is violating Part 2, Article 5 as well, was only barely addressed by the Superior Court. Now, in 1999, the SWEPT had a rate of $6.60 per thousand, and 20 years later, the SWEPT has decreased to $2.17 per thousand. If you look at a combination of that SWEPT together with the local education property taxes that are necessary in order to provide a constitutionally adequate education, a community such as Troy has to raise a combined total of $21.52, while communities such as Newington only has to raise a combined $3.19, a difference of 675%. And in other communities, you see an even higher difference, Winchester versus Newington, over 700%. So talk a little bit about what's going on. I know John Tobin is going to be talking more about the Part 2, Article 5, as well as a little more about the constitutional background. So John, do you want to take it over from there?
Sure, I'm ready to do that. And Michael, you need to take your screen off, I think. Okay. So, hold on a second while I get queued up here. So, thanks, Michael, and thank you to all of you for inviting us to come and talk today. I think it's really a good opportunity for us to give you some ideas as you take on these big decisions. And before I start, I wanted to thank my colleague in the amicus brief, Natalie LaFlamme, who played a big role in that. And I also wanted to thank Doug Hall and Jeff McLynch, who helped me with these slides. And I listened to the discussion the fiscal policy group had starting at 1, and I just wanted to say that this is a tough hour for our nation, and I really appreciated that you all were talking about that. And I think, as several of you said, working on education fairness is really central to healing our country, and you've taken on an enormous project, and I thank you for that. I am going to talk about property tax issues, but before that, I want to talk a little bit about the amicus brief, and also in response to what was clear from the prior discussion and also from other discussions, is try to dig into the general constitutional principles that underlie all of this a little more. So the amicus brief, we filed this brief on behalf of 25 school districts. The largest districts in the state, Manchester and Nashua and Derry and Concord and Keene are right up there. And then we filed it on behalf of 5 regional districts from various parts of the state. Some are rural, some are more well-off than others. Others have, Governor Wentworth is generally a well-off district, but there are disparities within that district. Some of the mill towns that have been at the forefront of this issue for 25 or more years, and a number of other small districts. And all of these school boards, we met with them. All of them are really concerned about this issue. This is not simply something that is of concern to mill towns or rural districts. As you can see, this is a real cross-section of the state. Districts who signed on to this brief because they want something done about this problem. And when you add all the students up in all these districts, it's more than 30% of all the students in the state are spoken for in our brief. And the goals of our brief, and let me just say a word about what an amicus brief is. It's a friend of the court brief. We're not technically parties, but the Supreme Court likes to hear from other people in important cases. They want another perspective. They want background, especially from other people who are concerned about the issue. So we took this opportunity to try to educate the Supreme Court about how the current system works now. It's been, as Michael said, well over 10 years since they've touched it at all, and a quarter of a century since they dealt with it in much depth. We wanted to show them how it works now, to show them that this problem affects school districts across the state in different ways. We also wanted to show them that the system's inequities have become a lot worse in the past decade. We have a couple of slides about that. And we also, and this is part of what Michael and his clients are trying to do, convince the court that the problem is urgent, and that sending the case back to the Superior Court because of the procedural issues that the state has raised will not solve the problem, will serve no purpose. The problem is clear and urgent, and it needs to be addressed. So those were our goals. And so what I'm going to do in this presentation is talk about the constitutional principles and weave in the arguments that we made in the amicus brief about the big issues. And the first thing I guess I would like to say is that the constitutional principles, there are some guardrails, but there's also, you will see, and as you know already, the legislature and you as a commission have a lot of discretion and latitude about the choices you can make to fix this system. So there are some guardrails, but there are a lot of opportunities. And then I want to talk about adequacy and inequity. And then at the very end, talk about why we said the court should set a deadline and how that fits with what you're doing. So the two provisions of the Constitution that are really the foundations of this, the one is Part 2, Article 83, that the Claremont decision said creates a duty on the state to pay for a constitutionally adequate education for every K through 12 student. And then the other thing that the court said is the taxes used to pay for meeting that duty must have a uniform rate. And I was listening before to Chris Dwyer asking the question about the state as a taxing district, and I will get to that. That's a reasonable question. So the court has crystallized the to-do list for the legislature. This is really the to-do list for the legislature, and 3 of the 4 things on it are your to-do list as a commission. Define an adequate education, determine its cost, and fund it with constitutional taxes. The issue of the accountability system is not as directly before you, but the first 3 gives you plenty of work to do. So now I just want to talk about the constitutional principles and the scope of adequacy. And the first thing I want to say is that as we all have lamented for a quarter of a century, the word adequate is really unfortunate. Constitutionally adequate education is far more than adequate. And this is one of the main ways that the court expressed that. And you have talked about this and seen it before, but I want you to just think about it. It's really an expansive definition of adequacy. And it's also a future-oriented definition of adequacy. In the late 1990s, were looking ahead. They were thinking about what do our kids need to succeed in the 21st century? So that's what you all, that's the basic framework. The court is saying this is not something stuck in whatever education was in the 1790s. And they made that explicit. It's not a static concept removed from the demands of an evolving world. It's something that is going to evolve. And I have to say, and I'll just say it and then leave it, one of the things that we didn't know in 1993, as much as we all know now, is the importance of early childhood education. You all have talked about that. It's up to you to think about whether that belongs in this now, but I guess I would say that what kids need and how to educate them benefits from growing understanding and insight and data and research. And so you have the opportunity to take advantage of that. The court was really encouraging you to take advantage of that. And then the second sentence in this quote, I think is really relevant to the moment. It's not just the needs of the few, but the critical requirements of the many. And one of the things that I really urge you to do in your spare time is read Claremont 2 again. One of the things that I find inspiring there in that decision is the way the court talks about the central place of education in our society. It's central for our democracy and for our economy. And Lord knows if we are going to address the inequities in our country, education is going to be the path to do it more than anything else. So, and the court saw that. So the definition of adequacy needs to be looking forward, it needs to evolve, it needs to be expansive, it needs to take into account kids that come to school with varying abilities. And this is another quote that's important, and I think it is worthy of discussion, and there's another one that follows it that will shed more light on it. The court was not simply saying that the right to this education is horizontal resource replication. In other words, this is not simply We want the legislature to fix a dollar amount for every kid and provide that to every kid. It's not like a debit card for $10,000 or $20,000 for each kid. No, it's a list of specific things. There's a grocery list there. These are the things that constitute an adequate education, and that is what has to be provided. It's the substance that the court was concerned about. And then, and this is a thing that Michael put in his presentation, and it bears repeating. The court said that whatever the state defines as comprising constitutional adequacy, it must pay for it. It's a state obligation. So there's and I don't want to say it's a core, there's a package. There's a constellation of things that constitute a constitutionally adequate education in 2020. And the state has to pay for that across the board. Then it also needs to look at the individual needs of kids in different schools and different districts and take that into account as well. So in our part of the brief in terms of the adequacy, one of the things that we did was really point out the enormous contrast between the court's expansive definition of adequacy, which is mirrored in the state statute that the legislature passed. The state's statutory definition of adequacy is also very broad. It incorporates some of the minimum standards. And then you compare that with what the state's actually paying for. Those two things don't fit. Cognitive dissonance. The state is saying it's broad, but we're only going to pay for less than a third of it. And then when you step back and look at the big picture and think about it in common sense, the state is basically saying that most of what's being spent in our schools now, more than 2/3, is optional. It's not necessary for giving our kids the things they need. The state is basically saying, whatever resource you want to look at, I guess we only need 1/3 of the teachers, 1/3 of the building, 1/3 of the computers, because that's all we're paying for. It doesn't make any sense. There's this huge disconnect between the definition, not just the court's definition, the state's own statutory definition, and what they will pay for. And even if we don't know exactly what adequacy is, we wanted to really get the court to see that the 3,700 is so far off the mark that we don't need to have another court trial to figure out exactly what it is. The legislature needs to start over. So turning to the property tax side, in Claremont 2, the court was looking at the situation that exists now of taxpayers in one town paying 4 times or more the rate that was being paid in other towns to meet the same state obligation. And the court was really clear, that's unconstitutional. The interesting thing about that is the taxing power in our Constitution is the taxing clause is a clause to limit government. We have a constitution of limited government with a number of safeguards against oppressive government. And the court's basically saying, in this instance, the taxes are oppressive and unfair because the rates are so different. And then it's really important for you all to understand, and it's clear to me that you do, that while the state can delegate the operation of education to local school districts, it can't do that in a way that leads to the perpetuation of these unreasonable and inequitable rates. I want to take a moment and deal with Chris Dwyer's question about state tax, local tax. That came from Claremont 2, where we were saying that these tax rates violated the constitutional provision about disproportionate and unequal taxes. And what the trial court said way back in Claremont 2 was, well, the tax rates are the same within each little school district, so what's the problem? They don't have to be the same across the state. And what we argued was, maybe they don't have to be the same in terms of police or fire or town roads, but education is a state duty. And the state has to pay for it in a way where the tax rates to meet that obligation are the same across the state. And so we have definitely a cultural history that says property taxes are local taxes. In fact, property taxes can be local taxes, they can be state taxes, or they can be county taxes. And it depends on the purpose. And there's an old case law that says when you're trying to figure out what's the district and you can't figure it out, you look at the purpose. And so local property tax to pay for local police or the library, that's local. The rate has to be the same only in the district. Education is a state purpose. To pay for that part that the state's responsible for, the rate has to be the same because it's the same purpose around the state. So this is a page especially for the fiscal policy folks. The legislature has wide latitude in figuring out how to pay for education. Wide latitude, lots of flexibility. The only thing the court has said, the court hasn't said you can't use property taxes. The current system uses some property taxes and some business taxes. The only limitation is that if you use property taxes to pay for education, if the legislature decides that, if you all decide to recommend that, then the rate has to be the same across the state. So there's a lot of flexibility in picking revenue. So the problem is not lack of flexibility in terms of the Constitution, it's political fears and rigidity about what we can talk about, or what combination of things we can talk about. But constitutionally, wide latitude for the legislature and wide latitude for you in terms of what you recommend. So in our part of the brief about the tax thing, what happens is, in these days, as you know, the average cost of education is about $19,000 a year. When you add up the things the state pays for, they pay about, on average, about $4,500. It just is really clear that $4,500 doesn't equal adequacy. As Michael Tierney pointed out, the lowest amount of money that any district spends is $12,000 a year, and that's in Manchester, which has its own struggles. So we know that number of $4,500 is really low. So the gap between what the state pays for and what it actually costs, whatever that is a state duty. That gap, and the state has dodged that. They've stepped away. And so what happens, the local school districts could say, well, we're not going to make up the duty, we're just going to run terrible schools. The state has really forced the districts to fill in the gap and take up the state's work. The local school districts are doing the state's work, the local taxpayers are doing the state's work. And so a piece of what is currently labeled as local property taxes is surely going to meet the state's duty, and those rates should be the same. So here's some of the data we put in our brief, and this is the pie chart that shows how much of the money comes from property taxes. And the statewide property tax is legally a state tax, but functionally it's like a surcharge on the local property tax. The state revenue commission issues the warrant, but it's assessed and collected locally, and most people just see it as part of the property tax, which is why it's all in blue. So current state aid is only a little more than 20%. If you give the state credit for the statewide property tax, even though the state never has its hands on it, the state's only paying 30%. And this is one of the things I said in our brief is, as a theme, is the situation's gotten worse in the last decade. The school budgets increased between $600 and $700 million from 2008 to 2018. Well, look where the money came from. Almost all the money, more than $500 million, came from increases in local taxation. So this problem that's manifesting in school budget rejections and all kinds of things has gotten worse since the court last looked at this issue. We wanted the court to know that. And I think you probably all understand about equalized property value and how huge the disparities are and why that makes a difference. If you don't have much property value, you have to assess taxes at a higher rate to raise the same money. You look at this chart, the red line near the bottom is the state average, a little more than $1 million per pupil in property. And you can see Berlin is only a third of the state average. Next to it is Moultonborough, 7 million. Berlin's property value per kid is 5.3% of Moultonborough, 1/18. So even with the state aid that Berlin gets, they can't possibly catch up. The disparity is so enormous. And again, going back to the theme of what's changed and how the system has gotten worse. Look at the differences in equalized property value in some of the wealthy districts and some of the poor districts. So this means that the problem has gotten even worse. And Pittsfield is a great example. In Pittsfield, they have essentially kept their budget flat for a long time. But even keeping it flat, they've had to raise rates because the value of property in Pittsfield has been declining. So the towns, Franklin, Pittsfield, Berlin, Claremont, however frugal they are, they still have to keep raising rates because the overall value of property in their district is declining. So again, the system has gotten a lot worse. And this just compels more inequities, and we wanted the court to know that. So here's a few examples. And in our brief, we focused on, we had 25 school districts. We tried to focus a little bit on 3 that we thought were representative. Derry, a large district in the southern part of the state, Hopkinton, a smaller district in the middle of the state, and Berlin. And we compared them to Portsmouth and Moultonborough. And you can see the huge differences in tax rates and per pupil spending. The people in Portsmouth are paying a much lower rate and they're getting much more money because there's so much more wealth to tax. Whereas the people in Derry and Hopkinton and Berlin are really sacrificing in heroic ways, but even doing that, they can't keep up. And again, it's not just the Berlins and Claremonts, it's the Derrys and Hopkintons and Milfords. So here's a different way of looking at this, looking at towns in one region of the state, the Upper Valley, and using Hanover as the baseline. You can see their equalized value per pupil is about twice the average. So they have the lowest tax rate on this chart. So taxes on that $250,000 home are the lowest, but their spending is much higher than Canaan or Charlestown or Keene, who have to tax themselves at a much higher rate. What does that spending mean? The last column on the right shows you what that means for a class of 20. That means that for a class of 20 in Hanover, they're spending $51,000 more than the class of 20 in Canaan. You can figure out what that $51,000 is not going for in Canaan. Teachers' salaries, equipment, class size, all kinds of things. Look at the difference in spending on a classroom of 20 between Claremont and Hanover. And Keene. Keene in that classroom of 20, they're spending $96,000 less, even though they have a higher tax rate. And all of this is a function of basing funding on small school districts with really disparate property values. And this is finally one of my last things on numbers. This is interesting because it's within a regional school district where the spending is the same on all kids. So think of a kid, a girl in Atkinson, sophomore, taking biology, and her best friend is from Danville taking biology. They're taking the same classes. They're getting the same education. But their parents are paying very different tax rates because of differences in property values. This is why there's tension within regional school districts. This is why some of them are breaking up or some of them are on the verge of breaking up. This system is so irrational that even within a school district where the spending is the same and the education is the same, the tax rates are very different. So this is, in terms of numbers, this is daunting, but it should give you hope. What we've learned is that 77% of the kids in the state live in school districts with with below average tax bases, which means 77% of the students and their taxpayer parents and families get hurt by the current system. So there's a constituency out there that hopes that you will fix this. And it's a big constituency. So lastly, the court, the commission, and the legislature. The legislature is the audience and then the decision maker. What the court has done for the last 27 years is give some binding direction on the constitutional parameters. And as I've said before, they are, there's aspiration of adequacy and there's restriction on unequal property tax rates. But other than that, there's a lot of discretion. And you all have this really wonderful role of providing some policy choices for the legislature and for the public. And you're doing it the right way: research, expertise, and public input. It looks like both of those things may come to fruition around the same time. And that's why in our brief, we asked the court to set the deadline for the legislature of July 1st of next year. So that's pretty much what I have to say, except I have one bonus slide for the fiscal group. And that's this: as you look at revenue, look at where our revenue comes from now. This is all the revenue sources in the state and how much money is raised. We didn't have room in this chart for the interest and dividends, which would be to the right of insurance, because it's a little bit less than that. So as you think about, you certainly may decide that you want to recommend property taxes or some version of it. Just bear in mind how we raise revenue now and whether that's balanced. That's it. I'm happy to answer questions.
All right. Well, let's see where folks are at. I know I was looking at Article 283 relative to adequacy and wanting to know, or just interpret, because adequacy isn't there. It is the cherish the opportunity. So we're stuck with the word opportunity in order to help our trades, our business, our institutions in the state, but to cherish the opportunity. So we've got education statutes, 193 E2, and we could do as was done in 2008, rely on that definition. So what's inadequate about that definition? What else do we need to be looking at? I mean, you gave us what the court challenges, but we're trying to define adequacy around and ground it through not just our statutes, but also in the Constitution. Anyway, we're looking. How much do we need to scrub the statutes in order to arrive at what the definition of adequacy is?
Are you asking one of us?
Yeah.
Are you asking each other?
Well, it's one for each other, but I'm curious. The court has used the word adequacy in its interpretations without finding it in the Constitution. It is only in the state funding statute 198 that adequacy, that the link between funding and adequacy is stated. And then, so what is adequacy?
So I'll address that one first, John. Maybe you can follow up. So we do argue in our case that the state has already defined adequacy, and what is defined as adequacy is both in the statutes as well as in the regulations, Ed 306. And so we don't raise in our case that the definition of adequacy is the problem. The problem is that what is an adequate education has been defined but there's been a failure to properly cost it and have the state pay for what it properly costs. And so there's no issue from where I'm sitting with the majority of the definition of adequacy. It's the costing and the funding of it.
I generally, I mean, I think it's always good to look at a definition like that about this key service and refresh it and update it. But I think, as Michael said, the problem in all of this has not been the definition of adequacy. It's the state hasn't been willing to pay for what it defined. The missing piece is an honest accounting of what it costs to fulfill that definition. And that's always been the stumbling block. And then the second stumbling block is how you pay for it. But the first is an honest assessment of what it costs. And $3,700 or $4,500 is so far below what any kind of education would cost that I think you need to start over with that part.
All right, Jay?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question on this? So I'm maybe I'm a little too dense, but I just picked up on two separate things. The definition of adequacy, which is, I think, what we're looking at on the screen right now.
Well, this is what the court's broad parameters of what adequacy should be.
Okay, because I was sort of thinking the definition of adequacy was this. Jay's been talking about this basket of goods. And I guess if we're not saying that the definition of adequacy is wrong or is not correct, then I mean it sounds like if we're saying that the state has failed to properly cost adequacy, then I would think what we're saying is that we've failed to also properly define adequacy, because whatever we're using as a definition of adequacy isn't consistent with what's on the screen here.
Yeah. Well, one of the things to think about is there's in the courts, and again, and if you read their opinions, there are so many different times where they said it's a legislative thing. We want to defer to the legislature. In some ways, what the court has done with this is to say, these are the aspirational things. It's not limited. It's not reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's a broad, inclusive education that helps all kids succeed in the modern era. That's about as far as they've gone. They said the rest is up to you, legislature. So the legislature has their 10 baskets, which are sort of substantive pieces of education. You could say, these are the 10 substantive baskets, technology, health, arts, world languages, whatever those are. Then perhaps what you need to do is talk about, well, those things don't come to kids in a mind meld. You have to have a delivery system. So maybe what you need to take a look at in that definition is, what's the delivery system? And assuming you're going to rely on local school districts, they have to have buildings. They have to have teachers who are credentialed and don't have too much turnover. They have to have technology. The current definition of adequacy is really the sort of educational substance. It's not so much the delivery system. You could go further than that. In lots of ways, the minimum standards have stuff in them about the delivery system. But I guess I'm not sure there's a whole lot of disagreement in the state or among all of you about the things you think are important and should be in adequacy. The hard part is, what does it cost and how do you pay for it and how do you deliver it?
Jay?
Yeah, Bill, please. Yeah, others. I'm looking for the rest of our committee to get their turn at these two well-informed attorneys.
Well, no, and thank you very much for presenting. And again, I hope all of you and your families are safe during this Very strange time we find us all in with Zoom meetings instead of being together in person. I wanted to focus I have two questions. The first one is focused on a disconnect that I sense in the presentation of the court constraints. One is you talk about Claremont 2, and it focuses on the fact that Claremont 2 was a tax case. It was not an equity case. Those causes of action were not addressed in Claremont 2. It said disproportionate rates that are unreasonable are the problems. That means in that case, it was the mill towns that John mentioned, Claremont, he was there representing them, Claremont, Berlin, Pittsfield. Those towns paid an unreasonably high rate compared to other towns. At the same time in your presentation, and I don't think you said this directly, and I'd like you to address whether you did or not, there's an impression that when you ask for, say, a number like $9,929 per pupil as an adequate as a cost of an adequate education, that amount of money per pupil must be appropriated by the state legislature and distributed to every district, regardless of property wealth or property lack of wealth. The disconnect is if the remedy for disproportionate unreasonable rates in Claremont, where I went to school, is give money to Newington at $9,929, as well as the Convale districts at $9,009. That will not reduce in any way the disproportionately unreasonable tax burden on the property poorer communities. That it just mathematically, it can't be a remedy. In other states, when school finance litigation causes courts to intervene, the courts focus on driving the legislature to pour state dollars into property poor districts so that their tax rates can be reduced, local property tax rates can be reduced, and they can have a better opportunity to provide a better resourced education to their students. In New Hampshire, it appears that even though the court was clear, what we worry about is fixing these unreasonable tax rates, somehow people are talking about that the appropriation power of the legislature must be used in a way that puts $9,929 or whatever the number is in every district. Whereas to me, the first step should be get dollars to the true plaintiffs here. The plaintiffs are the property poorer communities who are disadvantaged by unreasonable property tax rates. So I cannot reconcile a case that the standard of whether you've achieved the goal is to reduce unreasonable property tax differentials with an apparent or implied or suggested appropriation formula that says put the same amount of money per pupil in every district. In Massachusetts, when they result the exact same type of clause, Massachusetts gave Wellesley, a property rich community, $2,000 of state aid, and gave New Bedford, a property poor community, $14,000 of state aid. And that helped the people who are most in need. Could you please address this disconnect between, especially when I look at John Tobin, Attorney Tobin, who represented the property poor communities, not the property wealthy communities?
Yeah, I'm happy to address that, and there's a couple things to say. One is that, well, first of all, Claremont 2 is not just a tax case. Claremont 2 talks about the fundamental nature of education, that it's a fundamental right. and talks about how important it is to our society, which is the point of the exercise in lots of ways. But also the tax, well, one answer to your question is the slide about our 77%. That you can't address the tax problem by just sending a certain amount of money to the poorest districts. And this doesn't really, this slide, because the numbers are so big, doesn't show the disparities. But if you send, if you have a finite amount of money and you don't change the state's ways of raising money in any significant way, you can send, you know, and it would be a wonderful thing to send some more money to the poorest districts. But 77% of the districts are poor. And how can you cut off and say, well, we're going to take care of the Claremonts and Berlins, but the next town up, the Milford, the Hopkinton, the Manchester, even the Keene or Nashua or Concord, we're not going to help them out. All of that inevitably leads to differing tax rates. And we don't, Massachusetts doesn't, if it ever did, it doesn't have the same clause in their constitution that we have about uniform tax rates across the state in state taxes. So, but in lots of ways, one of the sort of fallacies in what you're saying.
But John, on that, could you go to your slide 22 or 23, I think it was, before this, just on your point, just clarify it for me. No, no, the other way. Other way, sorry. 23, I think it was. Go back. Right, yeah, right there. So look at that. Look at the differential rate. Claremont 2408, Hanover 1111.
Yep.
If you said to the legislature, the top goal is to reduce that tax differential, would you give Hanover $1 before you started moving the tax rate?
Well, I think the goal is fair taxes and not just shaving the worst off the top. The tax rate to pay for whatever the state defines to be an education should be the same. You know, the problem is that we do this through local property taxes, nominally local, and that's sort of sacred. We wouldn't, interest and dividends tax, look at that. We wouldn't say, oh, we're going to have a higher rate for interest and dividends taxes in Franklin because there are fewer of you who are paying it and we need to raise a certain amount of money for this state function. That would be absurd. We need to all pay the same rate for this state function. And if it's property taxes, fine. There can be a statewide, we have the sort of skeleton of a statewide property tax. We could have a statewide property tax that would pay for the whole shooting match, and 2/3 of people's school tax rates would go down. And it's really making sure that taxpayers pay the same rate. And, you know, if someone is wealthy in a particular, or someone lives in a particular town, they may or may not be able to pay higher taxes. But the point should be that we all pay the same rate for this precious, important duty. And you can do that in a way, it doesn't have to be income tax or sales tax. It can be what we're all used to, property tax, but the rate has to be the same. And it has to raise enough to pay for what we're actually spending. We're already spending the money. Really the question is how we raise it.
Well, the second question for Michael, and then I'll be set. Michael, in your presentation, you said you were looking for $9,929 that you were trying to request is your goal per pupil. Based on what John was just saying, that $9,929 would be raised in state revenues and then appropriated on a per pupil formula to every student in the state. So if we have 165,000 students, that would mean that the total cost of state adequacy would be $1.6 billion. We currently pay a total of $3.2 billion in the whole state and local. That would be a substantial increase in state funding of almost 60% for the state education trust fund. Is that really, can you confirm, is that the request that the plaintiffs are making in Conval for an increase to $1.6 billion statewide, or an increase of $630 million per year?
The way you have phrased it, no. Okay. The way you have phrased it, that it's an increase. Okay. Currently the state is spending on average 18 or 19,000 per pupil. Okay. And that 18 or 19,000 per pupil, okay, when you multiply it across the 165,000 pupils that are in the state, is a very large number. Okay. And a substantial portion of that is the state's obligation as part of its constitutional obligation to provide a adequate education. It is not 9,929. It's higher than that number, but 9,929 is closer to what is a education. No school district is providing an education at less than 12,000 per pupil. Okay, right. There's not an increase. Okay, it's who is responsible for paying for it. And we've had a number of New Hampshire Supreme Court cases that have made it abundantly clear that the entity that has to pay for it is the state. Okay, it can't be the local taxpayers who are being required to fund the state's obligation. And that's what we're asking for, is that the state be required to pay for its constitutional obligation, as the New Hampshire Supreme Court has ruled over and over again.
Is that not only in the districts you represent that they get that money, but is that in every district in the state, which would make it essentially $1.6 billion at 9,929? Like, is it just your plaintiff towns in Conval, or are you really saying every town should get that amount of state dollars?
So we brought both an as-applied and a facial challenge, okay? An as-applied would only apply to our 4 districts. The facial challenge would apply to the whole state. The Superior Court ruled only as applied to our 4 districts. At the Supreme Court, we're arguing the Superior Court should have ruled statewide and not just for us.
Good, thanks.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to just follow on that with this question. We've been talking, and your presentation is based on per pupil expenses. And yet much of your argument on some of those 5 essential areas that aren't funded today is that per pupil costing leaves us with some awkwardness in each of those areas. So one of the questions before us that we've wrestled with is the per pupil costing. That maybe that is at the base some of what is making this formularization of adequacy so hard to achieve. So can you address the concept that we should unbundle this idea of achieving per pupil expense and instead look at what the actual costs are for things like operation of a facility or a classroom or a transportation expense? Go ahead, Michael.
Okay. That's from your John. Okay. So I think definitely, particularly where it comes to transportation expense, that the actual cost as opposed to a state average just makes sense. But regardless of what policy choices are made as to what is the most efficient way to provide the funding, there is still a constitutional obligation to provide full funding for all. So I just want to make clear that if there was a different way in which to provide the funding, that there not be any idea that this is a way to bring down the state's obligation to fully fund, because the state has an obligation to fully fund regardless of the method of figuring out what that cost is.
Yeah. Well, I think we're accurately looking at two things. One is, what is the definition of what we're trying to cost? And the other is then, how is it reasonable and proportionate to fund it? And so for this, anyway, I'm asking the questions on the adequacy side. I'm just going to point out that we're nearly at 3:15. Others wish to address?
Yeah, I would like to.
Let me just say, Iris has had her hand up. I want to go to her.
Thank you, because thank you. Iris, if you have, go for it.
Thank you.
Rick has identified he has a question as well.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask John Tobin to continue to answer a little more fully Bill's point about the constraints or lack thereof of the New Hampshire constitutional language. I'd like to ask him to elaborate on what he sees as different about New Hampshire's constitutional language as opposed to other states that have gone with a targeting only system.
Well, I'd be glad to. And I wanted to get back to Bill's question anyway. I guess one way to think about it is think about other services or things that the state does, the state prisons, the state troopers, the state's portion of Medicaid. In the money that's raised to pay for any of those functions, the money is allocated where it's needed, and nobody keeps track of how many Medicaid patients or how many prisoners come from Newington versus Manchester. Everybody across the state pays the same rate at whatever taxes there are, and the services get provided as needed. I think the part of sort of implicit in what Bill is saying is that somehow we're not quite there yet in terms of understanding that the taxpayers in Newton have an equal responsibility with the taxpayers in Franklin for the education of kids in Franklin. All of the kids are all of our responsibility, and we all have to pay the same tax rate to pay for those kids. It's not whether we have to contribute a little more and still get a lower rate for this state function. And that would never fly in terms of interest and dividends or rooms and rentals. You wouldn't shift the tax rate to pay for some other state service depending on where the poor kids are or how many people or whatever. The rate would be the rate. And so again, the money's being spent now. The question is what's the fair way to raise it? And the fair way to raise it is the way we raise all of our other money for state functions. Whatever tax you all recommend, whatever one the legislature picks, the rate's the same across the state. And then the money is spent where it's needed.
Can I follow up?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to talk more to the distribution issues that Bill's been raising, and in relation to the constitutional language that's particular to our state. Because we keep hearing that we should go with a formula that's similar to Mass or similar to wherever else, where their constitutional language has allowed them to go to a targeting only system.
I guess I'm not going to talk about any other state because I think New Hampshire, each state does this very differently. In New Hampshire, we have a principle that this constellation of things called adequacy is the state's obligation. We just have to figure out how to pay for that however we want in a way where the rate is the same. And then how we spend it is differently. I mean, you know, again, thinking about interest and dividends tax, we all pay the same rate wherever we live. It may be that more of that money is spent on people in Franklin who need Medicaid, or people from Warner that get arrested and go to jail. We allocate the money where it's needed. We raise it differently. So we allocate, we spend the money where it's needed, where, you know, depending on what kids need. You know, in Manchester, the needs are different than in Newington. So we spend it where it's needed, but we raise it at the same rate everywhere. And that's not magic, and it's not foreign. That's how we do every other service. The stumbling block is the cultural thing about we can't do that on a statewide basis for schools because we're not used to it. We can do it. It's the only other arena, and nobody bats an eye about those other things, that some money from Newington goes to pay for some Medicaid for somebody in Franklin. It's sort of a social contract. We're all in the state together. We pay the same rate of taxes, and the money goes in the pot, and the legislature allocates it appropriately.
John, are you
They're all our
advocating?
kids. They are
John,
all our kids, and we have to pay the same tax rate. And then how we allocate it is up to the experts.
John, are you advocating, though, like other state costs, there are no local districts? In the school district context, we have local districts that need to receive appropriations. Are you suggesting that is the real remedy here to have a single statewide district and to do away with local districts?
Not at all. Not at all. How is
That would make it comparable to corrections. You use corrections. Corrections is not an apt example, I would contend, because corrections isn't administered through local delegations of local decision-making authority to local districts, whereas in the education field it is.
Yeah.
So the reality is, if anytime you have sub-government levels, you would face the exact same problem with interest and dividends tax or otherwise. It's a district-based appropriation formula that is causing the problem.
Well, I think it needs to be, you know, pupil-based, and the allocation formula is district-based because of the different tax bases. But you can certainly, and the state knows how to do this. The state knows how to send money that it raises through state taxes to local governments. The state knows how to do that, has always done it, can do it. That's not a mystery. That's not different. You don't have to follow school districts.
Jay? Just a quick question, I think for Michael on the 9929. Is that a, what's in the Conval suit, is that a flat payment per ADM or ADMA for each district, or does that also include, or does it, on top of that, is there you know, differentiated aid or cost for disparities or or accommodations for disparities, anything like that?
The 9,929 was base adequacy with the differential aid on top of that. And so for the Conval School District, I believe that they had approximately $800 per pupil in differential aid on top of the 9,900.
Okay.
So what the differential?
Were there changes to the differential aid amounts for, you know, the categories that we've got right now, special education, ELL?
Neither the Conval suit nor the House bill upon which it was based did anything to the differential aid at all. It was just left the way that it had been.
Okay.
It didn't address it.
Okay. Thank you.
Hey, Jay? Is Jay still around?
Jay, you're on mute. There you go.
Hi, is Jay still there?
I am here.
This is Rick Ladd. Been listening to all this, and I definitely don't want to go where Hawaii is with one district. We'll never get there. On a per pupil costing though, if we decide to leave that scenario, doesn't leave us much, but other than consolidation of districts, and that is going to take forever, and I doubt very seriously if we'd accomplish that. I think we're wiser in just trying to forecast where we might go. I don't think we're ever going to get away from having some kind of a base and then a per pupil funding system. But what we have to do is we have to integrate what Vermont has done, and they have a weighted formula for enrollment districts, which are very small. We have some that are, if you look at economy of scale, their per capita costs are horrendous because they may only have 60 kids in the district. So what we have to do is we have to have some kind of a weighted scale for enrollment of the school and of the municipality. And for transportation, I would not want to go necessarily with their actuals. The way they come up with actuals in various districts, it's based upon different criteria and different expectations. But what we need to do is be looking at again, another weighted formula, which deals with the density and the linear mileage of our routes. I think then we can come up with an honest formula which will support what we're trying to get towards.
Yeah. Thanks, Rick. And I think the similar thing could be done for building costs. I mean,
Yes.
50-year-old buildings cost more to operate than 10-year-old buildings on a per square foot basis. Anyway, David, did you have something?
Yeah, just a couple things. I always want to caution people while we're still in the problem space of not getting too far into the solution space. But also what's on the screen right now I find to be really interesting too, and I like what I think, Bill Ardinger makes some very important points. And one of the points I don't think he was making today, but he's made with me before, is that if you give the same amount of money on a per student basis to every district, and that while that might lower Claremont's tax rate from 2408 to let's say, I don't know, $10 per thousand to provide a quote adequate education. If you give that same amount of money, that 9929, to Hanover, there's nothing stopping Hanover from keeping their education tax, their local ed tax rate at 1111 and spending $30,000 per student. So I think it speaks to a distribution or an education funding plan that contemplates the disparities among between the districts, and whether that's poverty or whether that's facilities or geography or special education or the various other categories of disparity, and so it's not the same dollars going to to each district, which are to each district for each student, which could be essentially perpetuating the lack of the gaps in opportunity that we currently have today. And yeah, it's going to lower property taxes in Claremont, but it's not going to provide, and I'm just using the Claremont-Hanover example because it's on the screen, it's not going to provide Claremont students with the same opportunities that a student in Hanover might have.
Here, I agree with you.
Yeah. If I could add something, Jay.
Yeah,
Barbara. Thank you. It's been interesting. This whole presentation has been very interesting. I'm looking at the 25 participating districts in the brief, and I was superintendent of 2 of those systems, Keene and their other 6 towns. and Mascoma Valley and those 5 towns. So I know the disparities that are listed here very, very well. And if we keep coming back to the same issues, do we keep the same definition of adequacy, or do we indeed start looking at some of the things that are truly harmful to the students? And we've talked about transportation costs and facilities costs. And the big one that was brought up too at the end of that discussion today was important to me in particular, was the importance of early childhood education. And we have talked a bit about that, probably thinking we should not include it, but we should make a statement of some sort. I would like to get the views of our presenters today on that aspect of early childhood education.
Which one, John or Michael? Which one?
Anyone? Does anyone care to?
Well, you know, I recognize that adding this wing on the house would cost a lot more money.
Yes.
It definitely would. But I guess, and I'm not an expert on early childhood education. Probably what I know can be summed up in one sentence, and that's that if you invest in that early, you save money and have more success later on in education, and also just in all kinds of other civic arenas like prisons and addictions and things like that. So it's an investment that can pay off, and it's certainly, I mean, one of the things that we hear from lots of school districts, I'm sure you all heard this, is that some of the kids show up at age 5 or 6 pretty damaged, and other kids show up practically ready to apply for college. And so the earlier up the river you can deal with that, the more likely you're going to have a successful education system. I recognize it's a huge undertaking, but I think it's at least worth discussing. And I think it's consistent with what the court was saying in 1997, that the notion of what an adequate education is should evolve in changing times.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, John. Michael, I want to thank you. I also want to recognize that Dan Will of the Attorney General's office was invited to be a part of this conversation, as much as that would have given us maybe a fuller picture of the arguments in the case. Because it's an active case, it's the policy of the Attorney General's office to not engage in that kind of conversation. So we'll respect that. I hope to gain further insights, and it was valuable. And I think we can go back to notes that we received back in February, I believe. And maybe, Bruce, if I can ask you and Jordan to maybe just refresh the group's inbox with the notes from that previous conversation. Maybe that at least gives us a little bit of the balance that Dan would have provided.
Sure, we can be glad to do that. I did note that Jane had a question earlier.
Oh, sorry, don't want to lose that.
But then we have a little bit more work group business to do this afternoon discussion, so we'll move on to that. But
Jane, did you have something you want to add before
Well,
they
I
say
just
that?
wanted to kind of expand upon what Barbara was saying. You know, when we think about an honest assessment of what an education costs, and we think about our current definition of adequacy, we're really not focusing or paying attention to special education and all of the expenditures that are required of school districts that I think we all heard about from our presentators or our presenters, you know, who are special ed administrators. So just want to caution us about keeping the definition as is, just because it really doesn't get us to looking at special education.
Thank you. And I know I'm noticing I've been watching the questions and answers. I don't know, Bruce, are you keeping track of those as well?
I've been following those. We're not responding to those at this point, but they are very helpful, both statements and questions. They'll help us clarify, our thinking as well. So thanks to the folks that have been listening in, who have been contributing those comments in the Q&A.
Great. We'll make record of those and address them at another time. Is that the way we're proceeding?
Yep.
Okay. All right.
Let's see, I'll ask, let's see, John, would you turn off your screen sharing, then we'll just be on gallery.
Yes.
Jay,
Hey, Rick, yeah.
is it possible to get the PowerPoints that we had presented to us today?
Oh, yeah, those are always part of the minutes. Oh yeah, and we'll send them out to the.
Send them out to us. Thanks, Bruce.
Oh yeah.
All right. All right, folks, Jesse and Bruce, before we lose you, I wanted to are you with us for the next?
We lost Jesse. He had to go on to something else. Bruce is here.
So, this question about unbundling per pupil costs with maybe other units of measurement that might more accurately describe a school district's expense, either for a transportation or facility expense, is, before we try grappling with those questions on our own, is there some help that you can provide for us on those other methods? And not just for those two, but just, you heard the 5 essential areas that potentially the court is being asked to determine. Are there ways to do that on something other than a per pupil basis? And would AIR be helping us define that?
I can answer some of this. Certainly, there are a couple different issues that come up in here. For example, on the transportation cost piece, it's not so much a question of per pupil or whether or not it's like there was a conversation about it being a flat equal amount per pupil, right? We can model and figure out, for example, how much does the transportation cost vary from one setting to another per pupil, where it's a higher amount in a small, sparsely populated, spread out district, even if measured on a per pupil basis, and could be allocated through a formula that accounts for population sparsity, even if it's still, it's like an adjusted per pupil cost, right? And that can be done through a formula or as a separate slice on top of a formula that accounts for everything else. And we will certainly be providing guidance on that. I mean, the one piece that doesn't play out in terms of kind of a adjusted cost-based per pupil allocation is when you look at like the capital infrastructure investment. Operations and maintenance, I mean, it'd be nice if we had a way to model kind of a per square footage based on building age and all that kind of stuff, but I'm guessing we're not going to have that level of detailed data to be able to do that, but we can capture that as part of the annual operating cost of achieving the adequate outcome. And we also have a number of briefs. I mean, the fun thing about kind of being a bug on a wall in this conversation is we're putting together these explainer briefs on a number of these topics. And I'm really hoping that they are helpful. For example, we do have one that's forthcoming that addresses this issue of the connection between equitable taxation and adequate and equitable financing, right? Which was a big part of this, kind of trying to tease out the apparent disconnect in the judicial ruling. I'm hoping that our explainer brief on that is helpful, and I'm hoping we can get those in your hands early on. But certainly looking at how transportation varies with respect to district characteristics is something we'll be doing. Looking at how that, what that looks like when it's folded into a generalized annual operating cost estimate versus what it looks like when it's pulled out is something we are certainly capable of doing and have already done some kind of modeling, at least with the federal data sets we have available. Nice thing is it looks like the variation in the transportation expenditures across New Hampshire districts is kind of rational and predictable variation that falls right through the middle of the pattern of its neighboring New England states. So that's always nice to see that we're not dealing with the state that's kind of messed up at one end or the other. So those are the kind of, yeah, but it's great to be able to listen to the conversation and figure out how we can kind of put together the explainer briefs that hopefully will help out.
Good, thanks. And I think they will indeed. Folks, I'm referencing now the mail from Bruce Mallory at 10:50 today that laid out an agenda for us where the next part of our conversation is discussion of disparities to consider in the definition of adequacy. And maybe we've been talking about that. The differences of opportunities that might exist or other disparities. So one suggestion in looking towards our next couple of meetings with who it is we might wish to have define either alternative methods of costing or where disparities may exist among districts. And I'll just lay out one that we haven't put on the docket yet, and that was Amy Clark, the building and building aid and building assessment safety person at the Department of Education. So she, if we want to focus in on that niche, and I guess I'm asking, as what is it that we need to focus on to develop that definition of adequacy? And Bill.
Yeah, I think with what Bruce Baker was just saying let me get this right, Bruce Mallory, Bruce is from AIR?
That's correct, yes.
Good, thank you. I think it would be very helpful in a way to kind of get down the path to what your question is getting at, to have AIR lay down in a side-by-side what states like Massachusetts, Vermont, other states have, each state has come to some kind of formulation of what's important in a core measure of foundation type education, whether they call it foundation or adequacy. And I think it would be helpful to the committee to kind of see, well, what have other legislators or other members of commissions who have gone through this, what have they come up with? And see it, what do they think is important? I think in Massachusetts, benefits was a very important part of the last upgrade. And I think there are parts of as we heard, our adequacy formula that's deficient in not considering. I think that may be a real good way, Jay, to help get some focus rather than trying to dream it up on our own, be assisted by what others have done. If we could nudge our Bruce Baker and our consulting folks to help us along in that regard with a side-by-side.
Bill, I think you were in travel en route during much of our conversation the last when we were looking at the AI.
I apologize. Sorry.
But there is a section that we did talk about with AIR that was trying to aim at what Bill is talking about, and while there is the briefs that might take each of those discrete areas, I guess Bill is saying, is there one compilation that just might align us with some of the peer states that you think are similar to New Hampshire? So Bruce, you got your ready to go.
Yeah, the states that we had specifically planned to focus on for that type of comparison are states that have engaged in a deliberative process between the courts, the legislature, and arriving at a remedy. So very specifically looking at at how the Kansas courts and legislature have arrived at their remedy and what's been included and how's the adequacy standard been established and so on. So Kansas and New Jersey, and we would probably also be including some comparisons of Massachusetts, although there's not, you know, now it's more or less about kind of legislative deliberation over tweaking something that had been developed in the 90s, in part as a result of judicial pressure. So the more recent ones that are much more of a back and forth and establishing the components and setting an adequacy standard, where there's a really rich record of how that's been carried out, are Kansas and New Jersey.
And we've also asked Bruce and Jesse and their team to do other kinds of comparisons with other New England states, minus Connecticut. They convinced us that Connecticut was an outlier. But yes, there'll be a lot of side-by-side comparisons with comparator states and regional states that will help us understand the New Hampshire context.
Yeah, so I think, you know, there's a timing question in Bill's question of trying to move with some efficiency. But I don't think we're falling too far behind by at least giving AIR a little bit of time, a little bit of breathing room.
We haven't signed the contract with them yet.
Give us some advice and maybe teeing up a couple of people like an Amy Clark, where we know, we need to understand what kind of data she's got, just so that and I'm sure that'll be informative to AIR as well. And Bruce, you've got a couple of other folks that you've teed up for other conversations, right?
Yeah, I mean, this Friday when the work group meets again, we'll have folks from both DOE and HHS who manage behavioral health services and supports for school-age children through the schools and then outside the schools. And the multi-tier system of support is a piece of that. The Medicaid to Schools program is a piece of that. So we're looking at what revenue sources there are to support particular needs of students, in this case, who have behavioral health needs. That's a growing population in our state, as we know. We've also asked the DOE person who oversees career and tech ed there, because I think part of our conversation has been about an adequate education that prepares young people to enter the workforce, post-secondary at some point. And so we need to know about revenue sources and current program delivery systems through our career and tech ed centers, some of which are really integrated well into our secondary schools, some of which are more standalone. And then others, and we are seeking expert input in terms of description of the early childhood system and its relationship to our public schools as well, both the preschool programs within our public schools that are connected to our special education delivery system, and then as was noted earlier, the impact of early childhood on students' preparedness as they come into our public schools. Sorry. So yes, if there are others, and we just mentioned Amy Clark, who oversees building aid, given the conversations we've been having so far, it does sound like it would make sense to hear from her as well. But if other committee members, work group members, have other thoughts about the kind of folks we want to hear from, we can add that to the list as well.
Yeah, we certainly want to be building our definitions. I think we heard that so far today, and rowing in the right direction.
You know, the other thing I'll say that I heard today, trying to sort through our definition and challenge here, is that, you know, and the statement was made earlier by the attorneys that their concern, at least in terms of achieving adequacy in a fair way in New Hampshire, their concern is not so much the current 2008 definition of adequacy as it is on the distribution side. So I'll remind all of us that this work group is about both affirming what goes into the definition of adequacy, either the current definition or some variation on that, and our work group is charged with assessing current and modified distribution frameworks. And so, for example, a uniform statewide property tax rate would be a distribution concern that we will have. This is where, of course, we overlap with fiscal policy. Weighted distribution formulas to address disparities are not part of the definition of adequacy, but will get at issues of concentrations of poverty, population density in the school district, and student characteristics like ELL learners and so on. So we still have the differentiated aid component of all of this as part of our distribution charge, to this work group. So we're looking at both the core components of a definition of an adequate education. Are we satisfied with what's currently there, or do we need to think about things like behavioral health, transportation? We heard from our business officers last week that technology costs associated not only with instruction, especially post-COVID, but also technology costs relative to administrative technology as additional infrastructure costs that are necessary to educate one child or 500 or 5,000 kids. So we need to think about whether a definition of adequacy in terms of the student's educational experience also needs to take into account some of these infrastructure costs to guarantee sort of a baseline educational experience. So I'm just trying to reflect back on my own education right now as I get a little bit clearer about the components of our charge.
Yeah, no, I think that's good, and I think too that some of those socioeconomic factors, poverty, ruralness, or density, that when we were talking last Monday, I guess, about how outcomes ought to inform, and this I think is Chris's point too, how outcomes ought to inform our inputs, right? And this is where we need AIR to kind of catch up. Again, we don't want to presume we know the outcomes of various socioeconomic. We want this to be a data-driven process. So I assume some of their early analyses will be to try to tease out if factors that have worked to distinguish disparities in other states also exist here in New Hampshire, and to point those out for us. Bruce, I got that right. Bruce Baker, we got that right? Yeah.
Yes, and I want to acknowledge that Chris has her hand up.
Great, thanks.
Well, Bruce and Jay, you were both asking about people to hear from, and I go back to the very first part of this conversation of adequacy and equity that isn't about equity of distribution, but is about equity of opportunity. A lot of this presumes kind of a linearity that I don't think actually exists in real life in highly stressed, highly poverty districts where, the behavioral, what it takes to provide behavioral health services in a highly stressed district isn't just multiply the number of pupils by what it might cost in a district that doesn't have that level of stress. And the linearity of all of this is sort of bothers me. I wonder if it's possible to, or perhaps Bruce Baker, you have a way of helping us to think about or hearing from, those in the bottom quartile of districts in terms of poverty, stress, et cetera, where we're really looking at the geometric increases in what it takes to give an adequate education, which I just don't think is a factor of multiplying by the number of pupils. And I don't know if there's a way to tease that out. I'm feeling equity other than in fairness in taxing. I'm feeling equity in terms of opportunity kind of being a very slippery thing here, and then we're already slipping away from it.
Just to the extent that I can clarify, again, some of this stuff is going to show up in these primer briefs that we're putting together, but one of the things that we do is we look at a number of the different characteristics of communities, and we test the extent to which those characteristics affect kind of different student outcome measures. And we look at that in terms, and we describe that in our Vermont report as kind of doing a risk analysis, looking for those risk factors, those attributes of communities and the children in those communities that are the strongest predictors of having lower outcomes, again, on a variety of measures. Within that, statistically, we actually test for nonlinearities, whether or not there might, for example, be a increase in the severity of the reduction of outcomes, even with a linear increase in the change in the characteristics of the population. We then take that analysis and use it to guide how we set up a model that estimates what are the different costs of achieving a given level of outcomes in this community and that community, given these population characteristics and given others, in which we may also be looking at whether or not the costs of achieving common outcomes don't just move linearly with increased child poverty, but maybe escalate. Sometimes, and we test that for whether or not maybe those costs differ when poverty increases in a densely versus a sparsely populated community. I mean, this is actually one of the greatest advantages of doing this kind of statistical modeling approach, because we can test for these possibilities that as child poverty rates increase, or as child poverty rates increase coupled with increased populations of non-English speaking students or other district characteristics change, there might be complexities there that really make costs spike here or there. The really tricky part then is the more of those complexities we find, in the complicated cost model, how do we then walk that back to a funding formula that's understandable, that still gets the right spending targets for each of these communities, that can estimate what's adequate here versus there versus elsewhere.
Yeah. Jay, can I jump in for a sec?
All right, and Bruce, Mallory, I just want to tee you up for sharing some of that poverty and the number of kids ELL while our minority, that information that you shared with the other group previously. Bill, go.
So, Bruce Baker and Chris, that's a perfect point of questioning, because Bruce Baker, what you're hearing is that there has been a thread in this New Hampshire story, which suggests that even if the legislature wanted, in the core of its distribution formula, the appropriation formula, to focus on remedying lack of opportunities in a property or otherwise less resource community, that it couldn't, because the court said you can't have that kind of discretion in the distribution and appropriation of funds. That's one of the hardest things. And so I think the first thing to identify is we should work hard to identify the differentials. And then with that data present, it will become almost a moral imperative to focus precious state aid in a way that remedies or tries to remedy those inequities and opportunity.
Right, and we have one of our explainer briefs explains that kind of connection between the two, that it's one of the ways to look at this is we have a target of what's needed across each district, across all children to achieve a common outcome goal. And ideally that target can be achieved with equitable taxation across communities, which does not necessarily mean that you would allocate a flat sum of state aid across communities. If there would be equitable taxation, that equitable taxation would lead to sufficient funding to achieve a common outcome from one place to another, from one child to another, whether Manchester to Berlin or North Conway.
And Bruce, these are the weighting factors, right, that you're going to help tease out from the outcomes data, right?
Right, the weighting factors help us to come up with the target level of funding that would provide the kids in Berlin equal opportunity to achieve the same outcome targets as the kids in Manchester, Merrimack, or Portsmouth.
So Bruce Mallory, maybe give us some of that the data that Carsey has turned up relative to disparities among students and communities.
Yeah, and maybe this is actually a good way to begin to bring our meeting to a close, recognizing the time. And this is a good way to bring us back to the conversation that the fiscal policy work group began with earlier, and we've made reference to in this call, and that is what's going on in the country as we speak today on two matters. One is public health, and the other is race relations and disparities related to race. So a colleague and I are now completing the Civic Health Index for 2020 for the state of New Hampshire. We published the last one in 2013. And so we've looked at a variety of indicators of what is called civic health in our state, how well people participate in public life, what kinds of things they do, and how they spend their time. But part of our index looks at the characteristics of our state, including by functions like education level, age, gender, and where we have the data, race. So a couple of examples that bring us back to disparity and the current context. For example, African Americans in New Hampshire are disproportionately infected by COVID-19 at a rate that's about 4 times higher than their presence in the population. Hispanic and Latinos are infected by COVID-19 in New Hampshire at a rate that's about twice as high as their representation in the population. If we look at economic indicators, African Americans in New Hampshire earn about 40% less than the average earnings of whites in our state. And that's one of the largest income gaps in the country, as a matter of fact. About 15% of African Americans, I'll say it a different way, African Americans hold a bachelor's degree at a rate that's 15% below the rate at which whites hold a bachelor's degree in our state. These are just snippets. The other thing that we reminded ourselves of was that increasingly New Hampshire is a diverse state. So in the past 10 years, for example, the population of color in our state has tripled. And right now in Manchester and Nashua, about 30% or more of the population below age 18 are young people of color. So this is not your uncle's or your grandfather's state. This is 2020 New Hampshire, which looks different than it did even 10 years ago. And those differences have consequences for different populations in our state. And I think what connects all of us on this call is that we understand that our public education system is deeply implicated in addressing those differences and being sure that they don't become differences that make a difference over our residents' lifetimes.
Yeah. Thanks,
we'll be
Bruce.
publishing this Civic Health Index later in the summer. We're in the final stages of editing right now.
So that's obviously something you can spin your head around, or get Michelle or somebody to share that when it's available. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
sounds like an interesting report, and thanks for sharing those initial insights. Folks, we are nearing an at 4. Time always goes quickly when we've got presenters. We have at our next meeting the behavioral health and CTE leads for the state. I would suggest that we think not just in terms of where the funding for those programs comes from, but also the questions about COVID and infectious disease and school environments, and what kind of costs they may be anticipating in the future that have just not been included in statutory or funding formulas in the past. So just be thinking maybe there's some questions to that, and not just how we funded it in the past. And then Bruce, we've got David, we've got a full commission meeting next Monday.
Yes.
2 o'clock. Yeah.
And anything you want to tee up for that conversation with the group here?
Bruce, you want to take that?
Pending, we're going to extend an invitation to Senator Gaida concerning real estate classifications to understand what's behind that question and how we might incorporate differential kinds of valuations for real estate as a way of getting at distribution formulas and fiscal policy and so on. But beyond that, we don't have any other expert input lined up for next Monday. So I do think it will be an opportunity for the commission as a whole to sort of catch its breath and remind ourselves of what we've learned so far, what's missing. And by next Monday, we'll probably have a clearer sense from our colleagues at AIR about the products that are being prepared and the timing of those products and how they'll fit into our conversations as well. For the folks on the screen here and those listening in, a reminder that we now have weekly team calls with our AIR folks to continue to move this forward as quickly as we can in a very constrained, time frame. So it feels like now we're actually operating on all 6 or 8 or 4 cylinders, depending on the size of the vehicle that you prefer. Although ultimately we'll be talking about voltage and amperes, right? But I do think that that's a good thing. They're operating at full capacity. It's also a big challenge in terms of keeping those cylinders firing in the right order, to use that metaphor.
So I think a major thought for this committee relative to schedule, because we've been posting every work group session as well as the full meetings in the Senate and House calendars. So relative to calendar, if we were to meet on the 11th or 12th, and I just give us warning, the legislature may be meeting on the 11th and the 12th. I just don't know. I assume the Senate's going to meet ahead of the House, which the House is set for the 11th. So it might leave the 12th. The point is, by the time we get to next Friday's meeting, it will be too late to notice ourselves for a meeting on the 12th. So were we wanting to have a meeting, our next meeting after the 5th would be on the 15th, right? Which isn't so far from the 12th, so what the heck. Our next meeting will be on the 15th. We could have Amy Clark and try to do early childhood and building information.
Right. And that would be sort of more in line with, I think, what we had originally planned as we went down this, that one Monday commission meeting, next Monday the work group meetings. So we could certainly do that.
Okay. All right. Anything else for the good of the order, folks?
And
many thanks to John and to Michael.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for your service on this momentous, important task.
Thank you, John. Bruce, thanks for your work. Jordan, thank you. And may all of us be safe.
Everyone be well. Take care.
Carry on, mind the gap.
Out.